If you think of yourself as a World War II history buff, and quite a few of you out there, you might think you know everything about that conflict. You have read all the books, watched all the movies and the documentaries, and you know all the details about the T-34 versus the Tiger tank or the landing at D-Day. Well, maybe you have missed the single most important story to come out of World War II, and that is the creation of dozens of countries as a result of World War II, all the way from Israel to Ghana to India to Indonesia to Vietnam, and on and on and on. The decolonization movement of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s is a direct consequence of World War II. That is what we will explore today. If you look at the map of the world today, it will be dominated by dozens of fairly small nations all over Asia and Africa that are a majority of the members at the United Nations today. And specifically, if you look at the date of the independence, you'll notice that many of these dates are spread between roughly 1945 to 1965. Have you ever asked yourself how come all these countries became independent all at the same time? Well, it's largely a consequence of World War II. So let's backtrack a bit. In a previous video, we had explored why is it that European countries obtained such vast colonial empires back in the 19th century, and I've given you a list of reasons for that. So let's kind of go through them one by one and see how they compare to the situation after World War II. One of the reasons for the expansion of European powers back in the 19th century was the growth of so-called scientific racism during that period. The French, the British, and others were convinced that they belonged to a superior white race and as such had a white man's burden to carry out what they called their civilizing mission. This changes quite a bit as a result of World War II, in part due to the successes that Japan had early in World War II. Sure enough, they won. They lost the war in the end, but early on they were able to defeat not just fellow Asians in Korea or China, but they also take over French Indochina. They inflict some severe defeats on the British in Malaysia and Singapore. They conquer Dutch Indonesia, and initially at least do pretty well against the Americans at Pearl Harbor or the Philippines. There are some moments early in the war where they completely changed the way people thought of the relationship of the races in East Asia. An image, for example, like the surrender of the US garrison at Corregidor, which would be in the Philippines, really went around Asia and struck everybody. And that inspired a lot of people in Asia, let's say you're Ho Chi Minh, a young man in Vietnam, to look at that picture and think, well, maybe it is possible. Maybe we can wage a war of independence against a European or North American power and somehow prevail. Race, of course, was also at the center of World War II in Europe, specifically the Nazi obsession with race and eventually the decision to wipe out entire groups such as the Gypsies and the Jews. So in 1945, when the camps of Auschwitz and others are liberated by the Russian, British, or American armies, and people stumble upon all these scenes of horror, that really makes them think about what is the end game of racism. That if you start to dehumanize people, there's a point where you might want to wipe them out altogether and make them disappear from the face of the earth. And so racism, which used to be a pretty mainstream kind of ideology in the 19th and early 20th century, becomes taboo after 1945. It's no longer possible for a president of France or prime minister of Britain to make the overtly racist statements that would have been par for the course for an earlier generation. After the Holocaust, you can no longer do that. What else had led to a wave of European colonization in the 19th century? Well, much of it was connected to the strengths of France and Britain as economies and as militaries back then. In the context of the Industrial Revolution and the Scientific Revolution, some European powers stood head and shoulders above the non-Western world. They have Maxim guns, the others don't. They have gunboats, the others don't. Well, that changes quite a bit as a result of World War I and then World War II. Those two conflicts back to back are extremely costly for Britain and France, which are the two largest colonial empires in the world. Of course, both of them prevail. France and Britain are on the list of the victors at the end of those two conflicts. But those wars are so lengthy and mostly fought on European soil that these are victories that are almost as worse as some of the defeats that these countries might have suffered at other times. That's especially the case of France in World War II, because earlier in the conflict in 1940, the German army had overwhelmed the French army and invaded France in a matter of 6 weeks as part of the Blitzkrieg, those early victories that the Germans had before they themselves were overwhelmed. So for several years in World War II, France was under German occupation. Some patriotic French army officers decided not to stick around in France and accept to live under the German sun and left into exile. The most famous of them was a man called Charles de Gaulle, and his goal was to create a free French army in exile, meaning let's recruit a whole bunch of new soldiers, gather up some weapons from the United States mostly, and recreate a French army. Except you can't recruit people from France proper because, well, France is under Nazi occupation. So what is left of France that you could recruit troops in? Well, mostly the empire. The colonial empire was pretty much the only thing that the Germans did not take over. De Gaulle had to go pretty much hand in hand to places like the French Congo, Brazzaville in 1944, and ask local authorities for some help in recruiting troops. This would be the second time in 20 years that France had done something similar, because back in World War I, where the death toll also had been enormous, France had relied heavily on troops from the colonies, from Algeria to Senegal, as a way to beef up the French army back in Europe. Obviously, as of World War II, de Gaulle is not in a position to impose his views on the colonies. The home country, the metropole, is under German occupation. So he had to more convince the people to fight for the French army. And what could he offer to them that they wanted? Well, greater autonomy. And in his Brazzaville speech in 1944, de Gaulle hinted at later self-determination, future autonomy, if they agreed to contribute troops to the French war effort and help free France from Nazi oppression, which they did. So after World War II, both Britain and France are not exactly in a position to impose their views on the colonies. They are much weaker militarily. Economically as well, back in the 19th century, France and Britain had been at economic development coming out of the Industrial Revolution. So that's why they had colonies in the first place. Colonies were something that they could afford. By the 1940s, after World War II, that is no longer the case, because Britain and France come out of World War I and then World War II, two major conflicts back to back, sorely exhausted financially speaking. World War II was marked by a lot of bombing from the air. Early in the war, during the Blitz, England suffered quite a bit from it. During London, Coventry, various cities are destroyed in the process. France suffered even more from that because there's all the Allied bombing when France went under German occupation, and then much of the fighting through Normandy and on to Germany goes through northern France. So entire cities like Caen, Le Havre, Cherbourg, Brest are completely leveled. So when the war comes to an end, you have to rebuild all of that. The treasury is already empty, and then you have huge bills to rebuild entire cities from scratch. How are you going to pay for that, considering that the taxpayers are not doing too well either? That leads to a question as to whether you can afford the colonies anymore. There was a famous article published by Cartier, who was a French journalist. I think published it in Paris Match, which is a French equivalent of Time magazine. The article asked the question, what do we want to finance, la Corrèze ou le Zambèze? It's kind of a play on words. Corrèze is the name of a river in central France, and le Zambèze would be the Zambezi River, and he picked the two because they rhymed, and one was in France, and the other one in the southern part of Africa. And the question was, if France only had money to build one bridge, which one should he build? One over the Corrèze River that was destroyed in World War II, or one over the Zambezi River to benefit some French colony? And to people who were reading Cartier and the average French taxpayer, the answer was obvious. So more and more people started to look at colonies not so much as a way to make money, but more as an added burden on a treasury that could not afford any of that. And there's still some debate among economists as to whether France actually made money off of the colonies or whether it was more of an economic burden. It's a debate with a lot of implications because nowadays we live in a post-colonial environment, and many of the former colonies will look to France and complain that France made money hand over fist from its colonies and demand some reparations. Another aspect that led to a lot of colonial expansion in the 19th century is that the two dominant powers in the world at that time were Britain and France, the two most active colonizers in the world. Fast forward to the post-1945 era, and things have changed quite a bit. Britain and France were taken down one big notch. They're just a shadow of their former self. Instead, the two superpowers to emerge from World War II were Russia, well, Soviet Russia, and the United States. And both of these countries, for different reasons, were, or at least claimed to be, against colonization. If you looked at the Russians, communist ideology would dictate their opposition to colonization. The key text on that matter is one by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, the communist who masterminded the 1917 revolution in Russia, and he wrote Imperialism as the Highest Stage of Capitalism. That book claimed that capitalist countries, because they don't pay their workers enough and still produce an abundance of goods, tend to have a glut of production and not enough workers, wealthy workers, to buy all these products. And so their technique is to invade colonies so that they have captive markets on which to dump their excess product. So for that reason, the Russians after World War II tended to support pro-independence movements in the colonial world because they presented themselves as an enemy of colonialism, at least on paper. If you look at what they did in their immediate neighborhood and controlling Eastern Europe, the reality was a bit different. The United States came to the same conclusion from a different ideological perspective. The United States was born of a war of independence against Britain, so naturally many Americans saw themselves as natural anti-colonialists, that they had a natural sympathy for people from, say, Nigeria to Kenya that also wanted to be free from British colonization. Of course, the United States itself had been a colonial power in its immediate neighborhood, but let's put that under the rug for a second. So when World War I had come along, the US president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, had issued the 14 points with a key concept in there, which is the concept of the self-determination, the right for people to determine their own future. Moved forward another 20 years to World War II. Wilson by that point was dead, but his ideological heir, Franklin D. Roosevelt, would be the US president. And Roosevelt, remember, had served in the cabinet of Wilson back in World War I, and he's also a member of the Democratic Party, so there's a continuation of ideas. And so when Roosevelt articulated the goals of the United States in World War II, he largely borrowed from the 14 points, including that concept of self-determination. The key document there would be the Atlantic Charter, which Roosevelt drafted while meeting with Winston Churchill of the coast of Canada. And if you read through the whole document, right in there is the concept of self-determination, the right of people to govern their own future. And Churchill was not too pleased with this being included in the Atlantic Charter because that directly contradicted the whole British colonial empire. Churchill, being under threat from Nazi Germany and wanting to secure American help in the conflict, had to reluctantly agree to the concept of self-determination, which then became the basis for waves of decolonization after World War II. So if you combine all that, and it is clearly a push for greater independence after World War II. France and Britain are broke, their military is not what it used to be, they don't have the same sense of racial self-confidence that they had, and they're now under great pressure by the new superpowers to emerge from World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union. So now you know why decolonization happened in the first place. It's kind of a legacy of World War I and World War II. How and where did it happen? It's a complicated story because you have dozens of colonies that get independence around that time. But you could kind of chart on the line the dates for all these colonies and when they became independent. And you would notice that a lot of the colonies in Asia got independence fairly early on, roughly 1945 to 55, the decade after World War II. That's true of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Ceylon, which is Sri Lanka today, Burma, which is Myanmar today, Indochina, which is Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia today. I mean, you get the idea. However, if you looked at the colonies in Africa, specifically sub-Saharan Africa, most of them got their independence in the 10 years that followed, from the mid-1950s to the mid-1960s, from Ghana to Algeria to Kenya and so forth. The other way that you could distinguish and kind of group all these colonies in a way that would make more sense is by assessing the way that they obtained independence. Is it a peaceful process, election, nonviolent demonstrations, just diplomacy, or is it a more violent process where you have a war of independence? So if you were to start with the first wave of decolonization, right after World War II in Asia, you have some countries that obtain independence in a rather peaceful fashion. The Philippines would be a good example of that. 1946, I think, is the time for independence. The reason there would be the United States had tried to portray itself as a friend of self-determination, an enemy of colonization, and oops, we happen to have a colony in the Philippines that we prevented from becoming independent in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War and the rebellion of Aguinaldo. So maybe let's fix that. And the United States granted independence to the Philippines, and that's the birth of that important nation in East Asia. You have a somewhat similar process in South Asia, where through the campaign of the Mahatma Gandhi in 1947, Britain agreed to grant independence to India and neighboring countries that were also born out of that partition, Pakistan and later on Bangladesh. It's a fascinating story and a long story, so we have a whole video specifically on that one particular case. In some other countries, however, the process is a bit more tumultuous. The Dutch, for example, were not too willing to let go of Indonesia. It's a colony that went way, way back. In fact, all the way to the days of the spice trade, where the cloves and the nutmeg all came from a tiny set of islands in what is today Indonesia. But after World War II, due to the impulsion of the Japanese that had kind of shown the way, the Indonesians started to resort to force to demand independence, and the Netherlands, emerging just like France and Britain, quite weakened from World War II, was not able to impose itself, and so you have independence by 1949. The story of Indochina is somewhat similar. Indochina was under Japanese occupation for part of World War II. When the Japanese are defeated, the French came back and tried to reimpose colonial rules, and the local Indochinese, emboldened by the Japanese example, tried to obtain independence by force. The key figure in that case is a member from Vietnam. That particular member from Vietnam is Ho Chi Minh, which is not his real name. His last name was Nguyen, just like every single Vietnamese person I know, apparently. He was a communist as well, and a nationalist, kind of combining the two ideologies. How do you defeat France? Even though France would be taken down one big notch by World War II, it's still a force to be reckoned with. They have helicopters and airplanes and tanks, and the average Vietnamese rice farmers has none of those things. So how, as Ho Chi Minh, could you succeed? Well, partly by getting the support of outside powers, like say Russia or China, that are fellow communists, but mostly by using atypical warfare, asymmetrical warfare, where you refuse to fight your enemy the same way that they're fighting you. Otherwise, you're going to lose. If you have a pitched battle against tanks and airplanes, and you don't have any. So instead, employ the techniques of guerrilla warfare, which would become central in all these wars of independence during the decolonization period. And the minute the French army mobilizes, you just run and you hide within the civilian population. To do so, you have to hide, meaning not wear a proper uniform. That's a violation of the laws of war, but that's how you preserve yourself, your safety. And for the French, that means how do you defeat your enemy? You have the firepower to do so, but you don't know who your enemy is. And that leads you traditionally to employ methods that are not acceptable in war, such as collateral damage and massacres of civilian population, which will in turn turn the civilian population against the occupying power, and that tiny independence movement that used to be a minority of the population will become more and more popular as civilian atrocities against civilians become more numerous. That makes the war unwinnable for the occupying power, despite all the firepower that they have at their disposal. But it's also a war that the guerrilla fighters are not winning either, because it's not with pinprick attacks that you're going to defeat France. So these tend to be long, indecisive stalemates. The way you're going to win is that if you are Ho Chi Minh, you really want to win far more than the French do, because it's your country. You're far more determined. And you just bank on the fact that France, after 5 or 10 years, will just get tired and then quit and go, especially after they suffer one major setback at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. And that's exactly what happened. In 1954, after 9 years of war, France decided to withdraw from Vietnam, and Indochina became independent. Because Ho Chi Minh was communist, and because he wanted to unite all of Vietnam, north and south, under communist rule, that brought in another Western power, the United States, to prevent the unification of Vietnam under communist rule. So you have a repeat of another conflict, this time not against France, but the United States. Which method will you employ? Well, guerrilla warfare. It worked well the first time, right? So same thing, you fight without uniform, you hide within civilian population, and lo and behold, the occupying power of the United States will employ massive bombing, free fire zones, massacres like at My Lai, and just turn the population against the United States. The war will drag on throughout the 1960s into the early 70s, and at some point, in the United States, the population will get tired of the conflict and will turn against it and make strong demands for peace. You will outlast your enemy. The US will withdraw by 1973, and eventually North Vietnam will unify the country by 1975. And after, 30 years of continuous warfare, finally you have full independence under, communist rule. Ho Chi Minh was dead by then. He didn't see the end of the conflict. Just a little note, the first conflict against France is usually referred to by historians as the First Indochina War, and the second one is referred to in the US as the Vietnam War. If you're in Vietnam, however, the first conflict will be called the French War, and the second one, the American War. So that's kind of the situation in Asia. Independence through peaceful means, as in India with Gandhi, or more military means, as in Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh. Well, let's move on to Africa then, shall we? The story is quite similar, though it's a bit later. It's from the mid-50s to the mid-60s, where the majority of the countries will obtain independence through peaceful means, and then a few others through war. In sub-Saharan Africa, especially for the British Empire, the key story there would be in Ghana, which on old maps you'll see referred to as the Gold Coast. It's the same country. It's a pretty small country in West Africa, but it was a pioneer because of its leader, Kwame Nkrumah. He did so largely through peaceful means, demonstrations, speeches, op-eds, and so forth, which got him into a bit of trouble. At some point, he was sent into prison by the British for daring to oppose British rule. Eventually, though, the British thought they had a good solution, which was to organize a set of elections. And the British were convinced that they had carried their white man's burden with dignity and had done well by the people of Ghana, and that they were beloved in Ghana. If only they had elections, then there would be a majority of the people in Ghana that would vote to remain under some kind of commonwealth or dominion under the British rule. As it turned out, the British were not as loved as they thought they were. That's going to hurt. So that led to a big change in the life of Kwame Nkrumah. Woke up in a cell in a prison and then was told, actually, congratulations, you won the elections. Please escort yourself out of the prison cell and you're going to be free. And then eventually you have a transition where he would become the first prime minister of independent Ghana. So because Ghana was so early on in the path to independence compared with other neighbors, Kwame Nkrumah played a big role in promoting movement toward independence in its neighbors. And when many of these countries followed suit, and his model would be that of the United States of America, where you also had quite a few colonies getting independence back in 1783, and that would be the 13 colonies of the East Coast. And they could have gone independent as independent states, in which case today you would have a country of Rhode Island, a country of Massachusetts, a country of Delaware. Instead, they decided to create the United States of America. And Kwame Nkrumah thought that's the way to go. If you had a Rhode Island today as its own country, on the world stage, it would matter nothing. So why don't we do that in Africa, where all the former colonies become one big United States of Africa? We call that the Pan-African unity movement. That was a great idea, I thought, but that would mean that all the newly independent colonies would have to surrender their newfound freedom into a larger entity. And if you're leader of the independence movement in, say, the Ivory Coast, that means that an English-speaking neighbor will become your president, because obviously Kwame Nkrumah thought he would make a great president for the United States of Africa. And due to petty rivalries between countries and leaders, the movement petered out. Instead, what do you have on the map of Africa today? Something like 55 different independent countries, usually drawn alongside the borders of what used to be colonies. And just like Nkrumah had predicted, what you have is landlocked countries, small military, small economies, and each of them individually matters little. So there's a bit of a missed opportunity there. You have a similar development in the French colonies of Black Sub-Saharan Africa. An example, for example, would be Senegal, which under the leadership of Léopold Sédar Senghor would become its own country peacefully. What's interesting with Senghor is that not only was he a leader of Senegal for a long time, and before that played a role in French politics as well, but he also was a poet, a man of literature. And he was the father of a movement called Negritude, what you might call the black nationalist movement of poetry, where he realized that to become independent politically was just one step, and you also had to become independent in your head, because many people in Africa had kind of internalized the racism that they had suffered from for generations. So a lot of the poetry of Léopold Sédar Senghor, which is quite beautiful actually, is about celebrating the beauty of the African past and African history and the Black physique. You can connect it to similar movement that you have in the Caribbean around that time, say Marcus Garvey, or the poetry of Langston Hughes in the US, or going back to the Caribbean, the movement of Noirisme or Indigenisme in Haiti. So some countries obtained independence peacefully, but some other countries had to fight a war of independence. A classic case would be that of Algeria, a French colony that France would not surrender because that was the one colony where they had a large population of settlers. And they thought of Algeria as being their own country just as much as the Muslim population. So France remained in Algeria, had to fight a pretty bloody conflict there, and I'm not going to go into the details because we'll have a whole video on the Algerian War of Independence. Spoiler alert, the Algerians won and got their independence in 1962. Another country that also had to resort to violence to obtain independence would be Kenya, in that case a British colony. The situation is quite similar to French Algeria in the sense that you had quite a few white settlers. So the Kenyans, in order to force the British out, began an armed insurrection, which is a bit unusual in that it took the form of a secret conspiracy, something called the Mau Mau Uprising. To know exactly how Mau Mau functions is a bit complicated because it is a secret society. The members did not reveal that they were a part of Mau Mau or how Mau Mau functioned internally. And if they ever did that, there was an internal rule that they might be killed by fellow Mau Mau members if they revealed too much about the organization. So it was very hush-hush. In fact, I'm slightly concerned about telling you about how Mau Mau operated because I might fall under the ban on revealing anything about Mau Mau. So in practice, what did Mau Mau do? Well, they would organize assassinations of British planters in the hope that this would scare many British planters into leaving Kenya altogether. And if the white planters are gone, well, what's the reason for Britain to remain in Kenya? So to the British, they were assassins, a terrorist organization. To the Kenyans, it would be more independence fighters, freedom fighters. How do you fight back against such an amorphous organization? You don't even know who your enemy is. It's a secret society. So what the British ended up doing was to target all the young men from a specific tribal group that was associated with the Mau Mau. You're talking hundreds of thousands of people that were put in concentration camps, not death camps, but internment camps. Not because they had committed a crime, but only because some of them might be suspects. At which point you start interrogating everybody, and if they don't talk, and they won't talk, it's a secret organization, you start, using various methods that amount to torture in practice. And some of them will talk, and eventually you'll start to unravel the whole network of Mau Mau. But to do so, you have to commit human rights abuses on a vast scale. Militarily, the campaign worked pretty well and allowed the British to really continue controlling Kenya. The problem, the political price, that when the news about the suppression of the Mau Mau uprising reached the British Parliament, you have quite a few more liberal figures in England that thought, this is not what the British civilizing mission Africa is supposed to be about. If that's the cost of winning the war in Kenya, then we'd rather let Kenya go independent. And ultimately, in 1963, the British withdrew from Kenya, and it is now an independent country. So that's it for today. We covered the entirety of the independence movement of the 40s, 50s, and 60s, quite a dramatic movement, where pretty much half the countries that we have at the UN today would emerge from that period. We'll have a few more videos that will focus on the independence of India from Britain, the independence of Algeria from France, and we'll also talk about the case of the Congo post-independence and Israel post-independence, so you'll get to be able to fill in the various pieces of the puzzle. So that's it. Now you know something about World War II that you might not have known, something beyond T-34s and landing craft on the beaches of Normandy. And that one don't cha-cha.